Hello, and welcome to Excellent Ed's webinar, Cracking the Code, Leveraging State Data for a Robust Educator Pipeline. I am Teresa Lundgren, Senior Policy Analyst at Excellent Ed in Teacher Policy. Today's webinar brings together a distinguished panel of experts to pull apart the intricate layers of educator workforce data and its pivotal role in addressing educator shortages. Throughout this webinar, we'll delve into why educator workforce data is essential, exploring how it informs recruitment and retention decisions crucial to nurturing a sustainable educator pipeline. We'll also provide strategies to enhance the quality and accessibility of the data we already possess. We will have time for audience Q&A in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. Please put any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A window on Zoom. After the webinar, attendees will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording, an overview of major takeaways, and resources that get mentioned during the discussion. And now, without further ado, I turn this over to our host, Dr. Kara Kendall, Vice President of Policy at Excellent Ed. Kara, take it away.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, everyone. As Teresa said, I'm Kara Kendall, Vice President of Policy here at Excellent Ed, and so excited to be with this awesome panel today. And hello to everybody out there on Zoom. If you know Excellent Ed, if you've ever attended one of our webinars or our National Summit on Education, you know that we are an organization who believes that policy matters. As a part of that, we also believe, as if you're tuning in, I bet you do, that teachers matter. If you read a newspaper, listen to a radio, read a magazine, you are probably likely to have heard in the past couple of years about massive teacher shortages and what to do about them. You've also probably noticed that we've got a number of states trying to think through how it is we recruit more teachers, how it is we retain more teachers with great policies, some of like Grow Your Own. We've hosted a webinar on Grow Your Own about almost probably 2 years ago now. And in other strategies, policies that states are putting in place to ensure a more diverse and sustainable teacher workforce. One of the problems, though, is that we don't always know those policies are working because we're not really clear on the root of the problem, the extent of the problem, or the nature of the problem. And that's why we're here today. That's why we have come together today. We've assembled this group of national leaders to tell us what we know, what we don't know, and how to ask questions that will help us really dig into the policies that we could pursue and that we can recommend states pursue. So with that, I will stop talking and let the experts lead the way. I have with me today Dr. Dan Goldhaber, Director and Vice President of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research, better to just say CALDER. It's a long title. There we go. Shannon Holston, Chief of Policy and Programs at the National Council on Teacher Quality. Dr. Katie Jenner, Secretary of Education in the great state of Indiana. Go Hoosiers, no bias here. And Dr. Lisa Coons, Superintendent of Public Instruction in Virginia. Welcome to all of our panelists. And let's get moving. So Dr. Goldhaber, I'd like to start with you. Let's get real. What is it that we do know about educator shortages? Should it be like mass pandemonium and fear that nobody's going into the profession? Or should we be thinking about this in a more nuanced way? Is that a leading question? It might be.
I think the answer is always more nuance. So first off, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to participate on what I think is an incredibly important issue and also an incredibly frustrating issue. So I'm going to just begin with the frustration that I think what we know today, and I will get to answering your question, is very similar to what we knew in 2015, 16, 2007, 2008, before the Great Recession, back in 1999. And actually, there's a RAND report that goes all the way back to like 1953 that talks about shortages. And what we have found out with increasingly sophisticated research and data is that we should not be thinking about shortages generically, but that shortages are really specific to particular subject areas. STEM, English language learners, teachers of English language learners, special education, for instance, relative to people who are training at the elementary ed level. So we know that the subject matters, and we also know that the school and school district matters, that it is much harder to recruit and keep people in schools that are teaching higher poverty, higher needs students. Oftentimes rural districts struggle more than suburban districts in hiring. And just sort of going back to the frustration, I think that we've known many of those things for a very long time, and treating the problem as if it is a generic across the board problem has not moved us in the direction of getting more nuanced policy responses. So we kind of keep repeating the cycle of newspaper stories and generic response to increased challenge, which we do have today, of staffing classrooms.
Off mute, Kara. So I hear you saying that here's a great call for nuance, and educator shortages sort of, we know, it's interesting that you say we know what we knew in from a 1953 Rand report. As a nerd, I was recently watching LBJ's announcement of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, in which in 1965, he says, we don't have enough teachers in classrooms. We need to staff our classrooms for the future, right? So you mention both the feds and you mention districts, but states are really the ones that are pulling the levers here, right? To create policies that are going to sort of guide districts. So let's talk for just a minute. I mean, all states have at least some data on the nature of educator shortages because there's federally mandated data, but to what extent is that helpful? So like how is it informing what states know about the nature of shortages?
Well, so I should say states gather data about shortages in a variety of different ways. So sometimes there's, quantitative ways that they try to assess the supply and demand. Some cases, a lot of cases, they are doing surveys where they are going out and asking school districts about their vacancies, or they're asking school districts, how many people are hired with what is deemed to be substandard credentials. And they're using some of those kinds of measures to say, these are the areas of acute pain in the educator labor market. There are other states, and I don't want to step on anyone's points here, but there are states that are doing things that are, I think, more sophisticated, or at least moving in that direction. I'm looking at you, Katie. So I think there are ways that we ought to go to get more sophisticated data. But you're right that states are the place where the real action is, where you would expect to see solutions to issues of shortage. Okay, the problem is that in a lot of places, when people are talking about it and when legislators are reading about it in the newspaper, they're reading about generic shortages. Lots of times the data that we have about, for instance, attrition is in the rear view mirror. And so the kind of debate that goes on is not really a debate about contemporary areas of vacancies where you're contextualizing it with the magnitude of the vacancies in different kinds of schools or in different kinds of subjects. And I think that that is the kind of nuance that we need to move things forward.
Okay. So Shannon, I'm going to turn to you because I think you can help us elaborate here. You guys have done, NCTQ has done a few state by state reviews. When you talk about educator data and the data that states should be collecting, what do you mean?
Thanks, Kara. And just to add, I'm excited to be here today with this great panel. So thanks for having me. So when we talk about educator data, we're really thinking about kind of three buckets around supply, demand, and retention, all of which Dan mentioned. And a lot of the obvious data points, let's start with supply, are, how many people are completing teacher prep programs in your state, in which certification areas. But that's only really one piece of the pie, and that piece is required to be reported to the federal government. But there's other data points related to supply that are really helpful in terms of like how many teachers being hired are coming from out of state, How many new teachers being hired are re-enters into the workforce? These are people who either delayed entry into the teacher workforce or are coming back in years later after being certified. Texas just released some really interesting data reports about how many re-enters are coming back into the workforce. So all these data points can help inform a state strategy. It's just not about teacher prep completers, but where are you getting the total supply of your teacher workforce? And it makes a difference. If you're a state that's a large importer, you might have a different strategy than if you are a state that relies less on importers, or if you have few re-enters, maybe you want to think about a strategy to get people back into the workforce. So this data affects the strategy that states should consider. The other bucket is around demand. How many teachers does each district need? For which schools, for which certification areas? Dan talked about the nuance of those. How are vacancies being filled? Are they being filled by long-term subs, retired teachers, emergency certified teachers? Maybe you do or don't have some things to entice retired teachers to fill vacancies, or how you deal with emergency certifications. And future predictions to the workforce can be really helpful in crafting policy and dedicating resources to certain strategies. For instance, if you're funding grow your own programs, could we or should we focus on certain certification areas if you know that's a need in your state? Not just grow your own programs, but grow your own programs for special ed teachers, or grow your own programs for math and science teachers, or world language or bilingual teachers. So there's ways that this data affects state strategies. I'll add a document to the resources, but we did a few years ago, we collected educator data on what was publicly available. And then we thought to ourselves, states probably have data that they don't make publicly available. So we asked and we sent a survey to states and to get a better understanding of like, what data do states have? And we also sent back to them a customized profile to help them. If you want to answer this question about your data workforce, these are the data elements you need. And what we really dug into 3 areas around: what level do you have data at? Just the state level, the district level, or can you drill down to the school level, which are all different data elements? Can you disaggregate it by certification area or subject area? And what's the timing? What's the availability of your data? Because some states can get it fairly quickly. Some states, there's at least a year or 2 lag before they have the capacity, data analytic capacity within their agency to kind of make sense of the data. So we learned 2 major things across that survey. One, we learned that states have a lot of data available, but not all data elements are connected. And so it limits a state's ability to answer key questions. So for example, of the 43 states that responded to our survey, about 2/3 could tie teachers who are currently employed back to the institution where they got their degree, but even less than that can identify what specific ed prep program they went to. And then secondly, we learned that states often track teachers as individuals and not teaching positions. So when we're thinking about shortages or vacancies and kind of getting into that more nuanced data, only 11 of the states that we surveyed had data on teaching positions. So not just tracking individual teachers, but really understanding the totality of the workforce and the vacancies. It's really difficult if you're just tracking teachers to know, well, which of those positions are actually vacant. So there's a lot of work to be done.
I need to clarify one thing here. So some states have some of the data. There's a lag problem, and like, am I getting this?
Yep.
Think of it the way we think about test score results, right? Am I getting them in time to make a difference in the classroom?
Yep.
But the other piece here is, can you say just a little bit more about accessibility, and accessible to who?
Yeah, so I think I think there's there's a lack of capacity in a lot of state agencies to make data meaningful and such as a way, a dashboard or a report. And we believe it's really important to make data publicly available for a number of reasons. One, thinking about resource allocation and how we can use that to make smart policy decisions. 2, making it available to researchers so we can study things and understand and learn from strategies and not just make these broad brush strokes, but like, is the policy or resource allocation actually doing the thing that we want it to do? Is it bringing more teachers into the field? Is it filling the gaps in our high need schools? We want to be able to answer those questions. And so having limited data or limited data publicly available. Also, like if I was a teacher, where should I look for a job, or what kind of certification area might I want to go into that I know really needs to be filled. So there's a lot of benefits to making the data more publicly accessible. But we have a lot of room to grow in that area in terms of kind of making it understandable. States, again, I don't want to steal the thunder of a few of our other panelists, but making things as dashboards and maps and making it understandable to the general public is and policymakers can be really advantageous to help us make better policy.
Well, okay, so let's get to the thunder then, because we have two state chiefs here who've been thinking about these issues pretty deeply. So Dr. Jenner, let's start with you. How would you describe the state of educator data in Indiana? Like, what are you currently reporting, and what does that reporting look like?
So it was interesting hearing Dan and Shannon talk, and I was reminded immediately of, so I started in this role January of 2021. And while I was a teacher and school leader and district leader in the past, my last position before this role was the governor's education policy person. And so I'd travel around the state. And I'll never forget being in North Central Indiana presenting on some of the governor's education thoughts, and a superintendent pulled out a steno pad, like, how many special education openings do you all have? And he was literally writing on his steno pad for their region how many special ed positions that they had open in that region. And at that point, I mean, that was like, as a person who loves data, I was like, oh my gosh. So as a state, we had, when coming in, we had the old-fashioned job board. And this has been mentioned several times, but immediately we knew we have to build out a supply and demand marketplace to really connect our supply with our demand. So to give you a sense, in Indiana, we have more than 65,000 teachers serving in over 2,200 schools, and that's all school types. So in my role, it's we're a big school choice state, so it's traditional public schools, it's charter schools, it's non-pub schools, it's virtual schools. We look at all of them and all of the teacher need. And so of the 65,000, when we built out the supply demand marketplace, and Kara, I know we'll get into some of that later, but just to give you a sense, we have, as of this week, 1,422 open teaching positions. We also, on our dashboard, wanted to include all positions. So we want to understand, what is our bus driver situation? What is our maintenance situation? Because they all operationalize schools. But if you think about that, 1,422 that we have open with over 65,000 teachers, that's about 2%. When I talk to the hospital sector, the healthcare sector, they are literally jealous of our numbers right now in education because of what their need is. Not to say that we don't need teachers, we do. But it's really interesting when you actually put the data to it. A couple of other things that you mentioned that I just want to double down on is, again, we had used lag data for years. And again, now that we know the actual demand with the actual supply, we are triaging like crazy. So I know our top 3 areas are SPED, special ed, we need 306, English learner, we need 51, STEM, we need 171. And maybe in the next question, Kara, I could get into exactly how we're triaging for each of those to close that gap fast. But I mean, that's how we have leveraged the heck out of data in Indiana to just get after exactly what our challenge is. The only other thing I'd add just here shortly is Dan mentioned this. So in Indiana, we do not have an alarming number of teachers leaving the profession, but we do have fewer teachers entering the profession. And so, I mean, it's still somewhat of like a squeeze, if you will, but it's really on the side of teachers entering rather than exiting, at least in our state's data. And so we're trying to determine, and Shannon mentioned this, how might we attract teachers from other states and make reciprocal licensing easier? And how might we, and since Virginia is not a peer state, I can definitely say that to you, right? How might we attract individuals who may be working in another sector like healthcare, manufacturing, and attract them into education and make that an easier process? And again, I'll talk through some of that, how we're leveraging this data to triage, maybe after Virginia and Dr. Coons gets a
I'm
chance
just
to
impressed
respond.
that you have such specific numbers, Dr. Jenner. But yes, Dr. Coons, to you, can you tell us what's the state of play in Virginia?
Yeah, so similar. I know Dan talked about the generic kind of time lapse of data, and Shannon talked about not really getting a sense of the demand as well. And I'm really thankful that they set us up so well for that kind of conversation, because prior to the pandemic, Virginia collected data on how many teachers school districts had and vacancies on a generic basis yearly. They might have said this is a core teacher or this is an elementary teacher, but it really wasn't granular enough for us to deeply understand where we were fully staffed, where our needs were. And now we have a dashboard that collects data all the way down to a 1/10 of a part-time teacher. And we have great, robust data, not only as on teachers, as Katie talked about. We collect data on cafeteria workers, bus drivers, social workers, school secretaries, maintenance workers, and really understand that staffing. We also collect that by district, by region, by school, and deeply understand that. And we know at the State Department that we have very localized needs. So in some school divisions or districts, this school district could have a significant need, but this school district might only have 1 or 2 vacancies. So we can really understand that in Virginia, it's a localized need and how to support that localized need. That's really great for us and those of us who are data wonks and those of us who love to dig into spreadsheets and look at that. But I'm really proud of our team because they've created a data visualization board. And that data visualization board allows anyone to sort by region, sort by teacher category, sort by position, and really dig in all the way down to the school level for staffing, for regional needs, for fully needs. So Shannon talked about, I want to become a teacher in this area. What I want to go into, where's the staffing? What does that look like? That data visualization really allows anyone to access the data, understand the data, and understand where Virginia was. And because we only collected that pre-pandemic once a year, that's not very helpful. It doesn't really give us that timely information and those pinpoints. I'm a little jealous of my colleague Katie, who knows those numbers today. I do not know my numbers today. We are still in legislative session, so I am not quite up to those numbers, but knowing the regions and knowing those pieces are very important, and collecting it 3 times a year for us has really increased that opportunity. I would love to have real-time data, and we are moving towards that opportunity so that we can have schools report monthly and be able to share that data visualization monthly. But we are pretty current now, and having that dashboard helps us deeply understand that as we think about solutions with our legislative body and as we think about solutions as an agency, the policy decisions have to be localized. We have to think about localized decisions for Southwest Virginia, which is contingent to Tennessee. That's a very different need for the state of Virginia than our school divisions or school districts who are next to Northern Virginia or Washington, D.C. Not only is it the type of teacher, the capacity, where the demand and supply is coming from, but the staffing, the salary, the resources, and the pipeline strategies are very different in Virginia because those are very different regions with very different needs. And having that data on a real-time basis at a granular level and being able to visualize that and talk with that visualization makes it a common conversation that you can really problem solve around at a policy level.
Okay, so granularity, access, visualization, and timeliness. Now, Dr. Goldhaber, I know you thought a lot about this question of timeliness, right? So like how often and how soon do we need to know? I mean, listen, I have worked with schools and sat on school boards where positions have been vacant for an entire year, right? We haven't had an Algebra 1 teacher for an entire year or a Spanish teacher for an entire year. Say more about timeliness and how states should really be thinking about frequency of collection in addition to granularity, et cetera? 3 times a year, the sweet spot? How should we think about this?
I don't know what the magic number is, but I think that you want to make sure that you have the information when policy debate has been engaged. And so it is important that it is frequent enough that so actually I'll say two things. It's important enough that it's frequent enough so that it informs the current state of the labor market, informs policy debate. I also think that there's a lot about the way the educator labor market works that is seasonal, where there's information that could be learned. A lot of teacher hiring, for instance, happens in the spring months, but there's also good evidence that if you sort of aren't getting teachers early on and you're hiring maybe after the school year starts, that the quality of the people that you are getting is probably not going to be quite as good. And we're talking about people in a generic sense, but who they are is obviously very important, because we know that teachers have very different impacts on student achievement. I'll just say one other thing is, I think that the process that you go through to get the data also matters. So there are processes that may be burdensome to school districts. It's just one more survey that they have to fill out. I don't know about the accuracy of that. One thing that we've done is experiment a little bit with scraping data directly from websites. This is in Washington State, and we can put the resources up, but there's like technical working papers that describe what we've done. But we basically pull down the information directly from websites when school districts are advertising for positions. So to the degree that the advertisements are an accurate reflection of what's going on, you get very real-time data. We do this twice a week. So we can say, a week ago, this is the state of the labor market in terms of the number of vacancies across different kinds of schools, across different subjects. So there are these ways that potentially we can leverage technology to get the information very quickly and at relatively low cost.
Okay, so I'm gonna, which allows states and districts to be nimble, which brings me back to Dr. Jenner, because you already started talking a little bit about this supply and demand marketplace and how you're able to triage. I want to hear more, and maybe you can, when telling us more, explain exactly what nimble is.
Sure. Nimble is a vendor. I'll just open with that. When we did as states, we have to do RFPs and RFIs. We have specific processes. They want our proposal when we described exactly what we wanted, which is a real-time teacher supply demand marketplace. So a few things to that, Kara, is earlier Shannon was talking about, really, 3 types of data that are important to be as in real time as possible. And so I might just walk through each of these. Our supply side data, in order for schools to opt into this, the supply data has to be valuable. Right? Because it takes a minute for schools to upload their positions. So they have to find value in the connecting point. So earlier I told you we have 1,422 positions open today, teacher positions in Indiana. We have 13,240 active teachers looking for jobs in Indiana. Okay. So let's dig into that. Some of these teachers may still be in their educator prep programs. So they're not quite completed, but we've worked with all of our ed prep programs. Go ahead and build that profile out early so that we can go ahead and understand who is in the pipeline. But the value on the demand side and why schools are posting those is, on average, they've had an increase of about 500 candidates that they can now see just by virtue of opting in. So as an example, I mentioned that Indiana is a school choice state. So if I live in, like, right here in Indiana, within a 5-mile radius is what I'm willing to drive as a teacher, and I may only apply in the old days to that school because I saw that they had an opening or someone told me about it. Now I can say as a candidate, I'm willing to drive within a 5-mile radius or within this county, and all of the schools who have those positions will not only pop up, but you can also, if you allow it on your profile, the school can see that you're available as well. And so it's totally opened up the candidate pool and allowed more of a competitive marketplace for our teachers. And then the other thing so that was the supply and the demand side. I talked about that high level. And then we also, I mentioned earlier, the triage, with knowing exactly how many special ed, EL, and STEM teachers that we need. We launched, and you can Google these, but the special ed pipeline one is called iSeal. So we currently have 274 completers, 900 participants currently enrolled, and those can be anyone with a bachelor's degree, and we'll do the transitioning. So it could be from out of sector or within education. We did that with EL, our EL, we call it ITEL, and we have 269 people currently enrolled, 72 completions. And then we also did that, launched it because of the success of those in June of this year, I believe. We launched iSTEM and already have we already have 972 candidates in that. So that, and then of course I've been on the news, et cetera, to talk about it. Like, if you have an interest in education, here's a transition. You don't have to go back and do all the school again, but here's a way that you can immediately help serve in Indiana's classrooms. Finally, on the retention side, Shannon mentioned, these are less fancy than our marketplace, the old-fashioned spreadsheet. But I know
Better than a steno pad.
Yeah, not a steno pad. But this is all public as well. In our annual licensure data report, this shows for the past 10 years from every one of our educator prep programs, how many they produced versus how many they retained. So I can go down and see the percentage of retention. And then I can also see that, again, not super fancy, but this is every school district in the state and their retention. Or not every school, this is every school corporation in the state of Indiana and their retention. So we have not, we have a long way to go, I think, in our educator talent pipeline data. But by building out the supply demand marketplace and partnering with Nimble, now we have other sectors outside of education who are like, okay, how do we do this for advanced manufacturing? How do we do this for healthcare? Because imagine a place where we could just connect talent as states. So again, we're working on it. We still have work to do, but that gives you a basic level set.
So these data that you've just outlined, and you outlined how they're sort of interacting even with other sectors. But I'm really curious to know, so if you can tell which ed prep programs are best at putting people out there, they're going to stay in the workforce, are you using those data to make other decisions or to collect more data maybe about educator preparation programs?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kara. We are really, really interested in what the future of license flexibility should be for teachers. And how might that look? So I would say at a high level, that's how we're using educator prep data right now. And then the other thing, and this is a connected but a bit different, we're also really contemplating, when you think about ed prep programs, are we ensuring that all of them are, as an example, teaching teachers how to teach reading based on the science of reading? And so we've kind of been digging, I say kind of, we have been digging into what is actually being taught in those programs and understanding value add.
Thank you. Dr. Coons, I know we've talked a little bit, and I know that you're very focused on retention, right? How to retain teachers, but how are the data that you're collecting? Let's start with pipeline. How are you using them to inform pipeline decisions and where investments maybe?
Sure. So one of the key pieces that we have focused on is this localized nature of our data and the different marketplaces and the different places that are needing different types of teachers. And one of the things that is a pilot approach in Virginia is a Teachers for Tomorrow. It's a CTE apprenticeship program that happens in high schools, and the high schools have the opportunity to start juniors and seniors on a pathway and an exploratory pathway to becoming teachers. And those students graduate at the end of high school with an associate's degree that readies them into a grow your own apprenticeship that they can then, in their first 2 years out of high school, become a fully licensed educator. And so we are promoting a grow your own apprenticeship in localized areas where we have some major gaps in support. So that is one area that we're putting a large number of investments and a focus on is the apprenticeship model to help those localized needs in those particular licensure areas that are gaps. The second thing that we are seeing across the state in particular is a gap and a need in CTE educators who truly have CTE expertise. And not a lot of people want to go and become a CTE expert in manufacturing trades, in cybersecurity, in welding, and all of those things, and then say, hey, I want to go become a teacher. So we want to make some flexibilities in licensure that allow someone who is in those career fields to come and give back, maybe as a part-time CTE educator, transition out of that high demand workplace into a space where they can give back to their community. So we've been working on a policy framework with the legislative body to give some more flexibility for our CTE educators that allow them to be subject matter experts and come into the field and become CTE educators as subject matter experts and work part-time in schools and be able to, I might be able to work at a CTE center and a tech center on training people post-high school. Why can't I be in a high school industry and really mentoring and helping teach in those spaces? So we are working with our legislature, hopeful that that policy passes that gives a lot of flexibility in the policy space to our CTE educators. We have other licensure spaces for special education and alternative pathways because that is our #1 licensure field across the state that we're thinking about, but definitely want to be able to continue to think about licensure flexibility as Katie Jenner talked about, Dr. Jenner talked about in Virginia, and how we continue to think about the licensure approach. We definitely want our elementary teachers teaching small children reading to have a deep bench in the science of reading and making sure they are experts of that. But we also want to capitalize on those subject matter experts in a really innovative way. However, what we know in Virginia is that that data and that localized demand data demands localized solutions. And really, how do we at the state provide policy frameworks, but also programs and grants that influence decisions, but that our localized regions really have the capacity to build and grow, because we're not going to solve this in our capital at the state level. We can put policy frameworks in place, we can put grant programs to support, and we can come along side by side. But our localities have to think about solutions that work and are sustainable. And what we see from the Grow Your Own Apprenticeship is that the return on investment there is that we are retaining those teachers at a much higher rate when they go through those apprenticeship models, when they have a deeper opportunity for mentorships and have that full apprenticeship in their own community and in their own locality.
Great, Dr. Goldhaber, I just really quickly to our audience, please put questions in the chat because we are going to be taking them. Dr. Goldhaber, go. I can see you.
I'm not sure if we were doing the hand raising.
Go.
I just wanted to reflect on something that
Or
Dr.
our teacher, you can always raise your hand.
Yeah. I think that I'm reflecting on sort of the research angle on some of the nuance that Dr. Coons said about, like, labor markets are different. We are investing in grow your own programs. Lots of places are investing in grow your own programs. Very popular. I think it's hard to know whether grow your own programs are working if you don't have something like vacancy data that is tied to local schools and school districts to know if when you have a localized program that's designed to address the problem, that it actually is leading ultimately to fewer vacancies. So it's a connection between the data and understanding the nuance of broader policies and whether those policies and interventions are leading us down the path of having, you know, a better teacher labor market, a more well-functioning teacher labor market.
Thank you for that. I have to say, because when you used the term return on our investment, Dr. Coons, and that just made my ears perk up, it's a question that we are certainly asking at ExcelinEd. Like, are you able to say that you're getting a return on this investment of, you know, in many cases, federal dollars, but state dollars as well can be considerable. So we are moving right along here, but Shannon, I want to turn to you for a second, because there has been a lot of talk so far about the importance of timeliness and accurate data, right? And getting it as quickly as we can. But there's a longitudinal piece here too, isn't there? So we opened this conversation by going back to 1953, the state of educator shortages seeming the same. So what do we need to think about longitudinally to complement these short-term efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. So I think, you know, longitudinal data implies the ability to collect many pieces of data on individuals across time and spaces. So, you know, strong state longitudinal data systems, you know, can connect early childhood to K-12 to post-secondary to even the workforce, like those 4 buckets. I think, you know, the federal government has invested large sums of dollars in the past on student longitudinal data systems. So, you know, we know enrollments every year. We know the services students receive, their race, ethnicity, age, test scores, exit status. And so states have really built up student longitudinal data systems. Our need right now is that same thing to be applied for teacher longitudinal data systems. As I mentioned before, a lot of the data systems at states were built to track certification, let's be honest. And then states have kind of built these other things, but their employment might not connect to their certification, might not connect to the data in their teacher prep warehouse. And so I would call on us to advocate for larger investments at the federal level in teacher, building similarly to how we invested in student longitudinal data systems, to invest in teacher, the same kinds of things for teacher longitudinal data systems. So we can track, you know, even aspiring educators in high school to their prep program, to where are they getting jobs, to are they effective, and are they filling those vacancies and gaps and demands, and really think about return on investment and which strategies are working and how can we scale those. So, you know, I joke, but it's not funny. I can track my Amazon package from stop to stop, but I can't tell you how many math teachers we're going to need, or like, you know, simple questions about our teacher workforce. And so I think, you know, I think a big advocacy push should be on building these teacher longitudinal data systems, whether that be federal or state dollars. But some examples, I think that states that have done this well, North Carolina has built some really great educator pipeline dashboards that connect kind of their prep programs to, you know, retention, effectiveness, those types of things. Delaware has made a lot of their open data initiative, made a lot of data public. As well as connecting those. Colorado has also made a lot of that data public and tracking teachers. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in the longitudinal data space, and kind of thinking about what we've done for student longitudinal data systems. Now we need to apply that same thing to teachers.
Dr. Goldhaber, in thinking about the opportunities that are there specific components of if states were to build a longitudinal data dashboard focused on teachers, or if the federal government, what exactly do you think should be included in those?
I mean, I think I want to just emphasize a part of what Shannon talked about. We have really good information for people that are in the workforce. States need to track, you know, who's getting paid, where are they, et cetera, et cetera. What's really lacking, and where I think that there could be build out of systems, is the aspiring teacher part of it. Who is moving in and out of teacher preparation institutions with different specializations? Because you can't turn some magic lever and suddenly make a new STEM teacher, even though we might know how many people are graduating with a STEM credential. What we really need to know is what's happening sort of earlier on. So if you're trying to do more long-term planning, then you can think about, hey, we don't have enough CTE teachers. We need to do some planning around CTE because there aren't enough that we see early on in a teacher education pipeline or getting them from business and industry. So we're going to think about how to encourage people. But you really need to know that early part of it. So I would definitely say that it would be good to kind of understand who is pursuing a teaching career, and this may be, you know, about who's majoring in what. It may be getting information about like who is moving in and out of the major, because I think that helps us to understand some things that we think might be related to being a successful teacher. And this is getting into some quality elements. So you might be concerned, for instance, that the people who are going to be teaching, you know, secondary science actually know a lot about secondary science, as reflected perhaps by, you know, the grades that they themselves are getting when they're taking secondary science courses, or, you know, their entry tests into college, or their licensure tests, if those are required to enter a teacher education program. So I would say beyond just to like, what is the area of pursuit and where, that you want to try to start to capture some things about experiences and preparation in teacher preparation, so that you can better understand, like, what does it mean to have effective teacher preparation? Science of reading was mentioned. I think Katie mentioned science of reading. Like that has come to the fore because of research around the importance of the science of reading. I don't think we actually know enough about teacher preparation experiences and what's important. So if we move beyond just sort of the numbers of people and get into the quality of people and the kind of training that's helpful, we need that kind of information.
I can promise you we're trying in science of reading. Okay, Teresa, I'm going to turn to you because I think we might have some questions from the audience.
Yes, excellent. We're going to start with one directed at Dr. Goldhaber. Do you have any resources that you can share on scraping data and how states can do that?
Yeah, there are a couple of Calder Center working papers that describe the data scraping, what we have done. The actual nuance of the process is more than we're putting into the papers. We're not talking about the Python coding, but it was mentioned that Indiana is working with Nimble, a vendor who is thinking about doing that in the private sector. So I think that there is increased interest in this kind of scraping that is out there. If folks want to reach out to me to get more kind of information about the evolution of the scraping that we've done in Washington State, they're welcome to do that. If it's not, I mean, they're welcome to do that regardless, but some of the details are probably in those Calder working papers too.
And those would probably be on your website, I can assume?
They're on, yeah, caldercenter.org is where the information can be found.
Thank you.
The next question, I believe, is directed at Dr. Coons, but Dr. Jenner might also have an answer. Are you working with the workforce board in your state?
We actually have a coordinated effort across state agencies and have a workforce board. And we also have some significant apprenticeship that are starting to connect data systems and connect data systems more robustly. But I would say we are in the early phases of that.
Dr. Jenner, do you have a similar program like that?
We do. I think most states are required to have a state workforce board. I sit on that board for Indiana in my role. And I would echo what Dr. Coons said. I think we're working more towards system alignment. But I'll be really honest with you. We're driving it. It was a governor's agenda item, which gave me, quite frankly, since it was his agenda item, the ability to move fast. And so we've driven it in the K-12 space. But yes, actively do sit on the workforce cabinet, but I think there's greater opportunity to work together there.
And then the last one for now, unless we get some more questions in the Q&A box, is how have you seen districts or states, and this I think is open to anyone, tackle the issue of educator diversity with relation to student identity and community demographics? We know that it's important for there to be shared identities between students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, to share those backgrounds with their teachers in terms of student outcomes and positive educational experiences. So how are states tracking this data-wise? And have there been any innovative approaches that you've seen?
I'll start in. There's a lot embedded in that question. I think that I'll advertise again. If you go to the CALDER Center website, there is something called the Teacher Pipeline Diversity Tool. And my conclusion from using the information that is out there about sort of what influences the diversity of the teacher workforce, which I do think is important, is that to really move the needle, you need to get more educators of color, people of color, into the educator pipeline early. That focusing just on retention doesn't change that much, because there are relatively few educators of color in the teaching profession now. So you're working on a relatively small base. And that's what this teacher diversity pipeline shows. States are doing a variety of different things that I think I think they have to, in many cases, be careful about this, because you can't do things that are going to directly direct resources to people based on race and ethnicity, but you can do programs that are going to target people in a local community that presumably is going to reflect the needs of the student demographics. And so Grow Your Own is oftentimes a strategy that is to both direct resources to local needs and to try to diversify the workforce in local communities, because it is helpful, especially for students of color, to have role models of color. But I would also lastly, and I'm just droning on and I apologize, but I'd lastly go back to this issue of understanding what's happening early on in the teacher pipeline, because I think that a big issue that we have is that there just aren't prospective educators of color that are choosing to teach. And there are probably lots of good reasons for this, but it suggests we need to know more about the early pipeline and the reasons that people are making choices to pursue a career in teaching or not, to actually address the problem.
Dr. Coons.
I think one other thing that Grow Your Own provides around diversity is a lot of times there are people inside our school communities who have always wanted to become teachers. Our cafeteria workers, our school secretaries, they are drawn to that school community, but might not be able to have the means or ways to become an educator. And a lot of times those are our diverse, challenged folks who want to become teachers in their own communities, and having a Grow Your Own approach, which allows them to stay in the school, work as an instructional assistant, become paid for that experience, and still get their industry credentials as a teacher, allows them the opportunity to provide the diversity that we need in our workforce, and helping our high school students who are thinking about educators, captures them in that interest early. So I think there are opportunities inside the apprenticeship model that we have not thought about when we're thinking about equity and diversity in the workforce.
So I'll just chime in as well. I mean, we have, again, by all means, we have work to do in this space. In Indiana, we have the William A. Crawford Minority Teacher Scholarship that the General Assembly has invested in for years, which is very specifically, and that you can Google that. It's available online. It's very specifically focused on Black and Hispanic teachers and others. And then we also To Dan's point, Ivy Tech Community College, which is statewide, has partnered with Marian University, which I know NCTQ rates as an A+ for science of reading. They always say that, so I have to, but they partnered together specifically in our urban areas for Grow Your Own targeted, especially to increase our diversity in our teaching population. We additionally collect, I mentioned all the data that we collect. We do collect that on our marketplace. From both supply and demand side, supply side. The only other thing I would elevate, and this was really elevated at the Excel and Ed National Conference, is for years and years, we've talked about the need for additional teachers of color, which absolutely would be very beneficial. But the other demographic, if you will, that we need is men. Male teachers. And that was discussed at the Excel and Ed National Conference. Dr. Richard Reeves was on the main stage and talked about really the incredible value that has in the classroom. So just to elevate that too, and to full disclosure, tell you, we do not have a strategy to recruit more men as of right now. And I don't know that many states do, but that's another challenge we have.
And actually, what's interesting on that point is people don't know it, but actually the teacher workforce has become more diverse over the last few decades. It's just that the diversity of the teacher workforce has not kept up with the diversity of the student body, but it has become a more female-dominated profession, and it already was a relatively female-dominated profession. So that gap is moving in kind of the wrong direction.
I am the mother of 2 young boys. Each of those boys has had a male teacher every year, kindergarten through 4th grade. Wow. And it's a miracle. I don't know how the school's doing it, but somebody should go talk to them. Okay, we have covered so much ground. We really have 1 minute left. So I have got a question just for each of you. And Dr. Jenner, I think that you really sort of kicked us off here and giving us things that states should be thinking about. But the question for each panelist in 1 sentence or less, if you can, is if there's one thing you would have states or the advocates do tomorrow, and maybe it's something that your state has already done that has been really successful, what would it be? And I'm just gonna let just jump in here. What is the one thing it would be? Dr. Coons, you've got something.
I think we need to elevate educators as a workforce as a whole. And if we want younger people to be interested, if we want men to be interested, if we want diversity, we have to honor and talk about what great work our teachers are doing and what a great profession that teaching is and what teachers do to impact all of our society. I think that's essential.
Okay.
Don't treat teachers as generic commodities. Focus on the skills that you are looking for, the places that you want to staff, the nuance that we talked about today.
Shannon, how about you?
I think I would think about how you can use technology to make things easier and gather data easier. I think Indiana is a good example of that, of pulling data from their marketplace. But we should be able to answer these questions, and we need to build our technology systems to be able to answer them in a more efficient, effective way so we can get to solutions and using our resources.
Dr. Jenner, last word.
Yeah, I would say yes to every single thing that was said. So let's do a yes and. This was brought up, but how do we better understand the qualitative side, the quality? I think we have not met the mark on that. And that's, again, how we can better support our teachers too, when we understand what they need or what they're lacking when they come out of the ed prep program. So it's a yes and. But the elevating teachers, that's number one. And by the way, it starts with us as teachers. We have to elevate and encourage young people to join us. And we need good people. We have to be our cheerleaders for our profession too.
Wonderful way to end. Thank you all to all of our brilliant panelists. Really, we appreciate your time today. And to the audience, you can find us at excelanded.org, and I'm sure that there will be information available if you go to the webinar invitation, and we can try and funnel any questions for these wonderful panelists their way. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the
Great
rest
to
of
be
your
with you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.